You're a royal physician standing in Windsor Castle on Christmas Day 1453, and you're holding a red-hot iron rod that you're about to press against the naked flesh of the King of England. And you already know it won't work, because nothing has worked for 16 months. Your name is John Arundel. You've studied at Montpellier and Paris. You understand humoral theory and bloodletting and the entire corpus of Galenic medicine. And right now, all that knowledge is completely useless, because the man sitting on the throne in front of you is not responding to anything. King Henry VI stares at the far wall with eyes that see nothing. You've tried everything over the past year and a half. You've bled him repeatedly, opening veins to release the corrupt humors that must be causing this affliction. You've shaved his head and applied poultices. You've forced purgatives down his throat, violent emetics designed to expel whatever poison has seized his mind. You've had him carried into sunlight, plunged into cold water, subjected to loud noises. Nothing. He sits. He breathes. Occasionally, servants feed him, and he swallows mechanically. But he doesn't speak. He doesn't acknowledge questions. He doesn't react to pain. When his son was born 3 months ago, the heir to the throne of England, courtiers brought the infant to Henry, hoping fatherhood might shock him back to consciousness. The king looked at his own child with the same blank, empty stare he gives to walls. Now you're trying the hot iron because maybe, just maybe, sudden, intense pain will break through whatever has locked his mind away. The room smells of expensive incense trying to cover the smell of a man who hasn't bathed properly in weeks because he won't cooperate with washing. Other physicians watch nervously. The Queen Margaret of Anjou, 23 years old and terrified, stands in the doorway with her infant son, watching you prepare to torture her husband in the desperate hope it might cure him. You press the glowing iron against the king's bare shoulder. The smell of burning flesh fills the room immediately, that distinctive, nauseating odor of seared skin and fat. The king does not scream, does not flinch, does not even blink. His eyes continue staring at nothing while his flesh burns. You pull the iron away, heart sinking, because you've just confirmed what everyone in this room already knew: the King of England is gone. His body breathes and eats and shits, but the person who ruled is simply absent, and without the king's voice, without his seal, without his authority to issue commands and make decisions. The entire machinery of English government has frozen solid. Before we dive into one of history's most savage civil wars, where English nobility literally slaughtered itself in a 30-year bloodbath, triggered by one man's mental collapse, smash that like button and subscribe to Map-Room Battles for the battles that actually decided the fate of nations. Comment: where are you watching from right now? What happens next will be determined not by military strategy or noble ideals, but by raw, desperate power struggles between men who understand that in a kingdom without a functioning king, violence is the only language that works. Let's go back to understand how England arrived at this catastrophic moment. The Kingdom of England in 1453 was not some barbaric backwater. It was one of the most sophisticated states in Europe with complex legal systems, established parliamentary traditions, wealthy cities, and centuries of institutional development. But it had one critical vulnerability. The entire system depended absolutely on the personal authority of one man, the king. Medieval monarchy wasn't just symbolic leadership. The king was the source of all legal authority, all military command, all governmental legitimacy. When Henry VI issued an order, it had force because it came from the king, God's anointed representative on earth, chosen by divine right to rule. Court cases were decided in the king's name. Criminals were prosecuted under the king's peace. Military commanders received their authority from royal commission. Property disputes were settled by appealing to the king's justice. Remove the king's active participation, and the entire system simply stopped functioning. No one could legally make decisions because all legitimate authority flowed from a source that was no longer flowing. And England in 1453 needed decisive leadership desperately because the kingdom was facing multiple crises simultaneously. The 100 Years' War with France, that century-long struggle for the French throne that had defined English foreign policy and military culture for generations, had just ended in catastrophic, humiliating defeat. England had lost virtually all its French territories. Towns and castles that English kings had held for decades were gone. Normandy, conquered by Henry V at enormous cost in blood and treasure, had fallen back to French control. Bordeaux, English for 3 centuries, was lost. By 1453, England retained only Calais, a single port city on the French coast. Everything else was gone. The psychological and economic impact was devastating. Thousands of English soldiers, professional warriors who'd spent their entire adult lives fighting in France, were returning home to a kingdom that had no use for them. These weren't farmers who'd been temporarily called to military service and could return to agriculture. These were career soldiers, men who knew how to kill efficiently and how to organize violence for profit through looting and ransom. They came back to England, expecting rewards for their service, and found a kingdom with no money to pay them, no new wars to employ them, and a social structure that had no place for unemployed professional killers. So they did what professional soldiers do when traditional employment disappears. They looked for new employers. And England's great noble families, the magnates who controlled vast estates, private armies, and regional power structures were absolutely willing to hire. This is where we need to understand the system called bastard feudalism, which was fundamentally different from earlier feudal relationships. In classical feudalism, military service came from land tenure. You held land from a lord, and in exchange, you owed military service. The relationship was hereditary and bound by complex webs of obligation that went beyond simple monetary exchange. Bastard feudalism was much more transactional. Great lords retained armed men through contracts and cash payments. They dressed their retainers in distinctive livery-colored clothing that marked who you served. The Earl of Warwick, for example, traveled with retinues of 600 men, all wearing his red livery, eating his food, receiving his wages, swearing loyalty to him personally. Not to the king, to Warwick. This created a situation where England's greatest nobles commanded what were essentially private armies larger than some countries' national forces. And they used these armies to enforce their will, protect their interests, and wage what amounted to private wars against rivals. The king's role was supposed to be mediating between these competing power centers, using royal authority to prevent noble conflicts from escalating into open warfare. But when the king became catatonic, that mediating authority vanished. The moment Henry VI's mind shut down, Two predators immediately moved to fill the power vacuum. On one side, Queen Margaret of Anjou. She was 23 years old, foreign-born French, holding an infant son whose legitimacy to inherit the throne depended entirely on maintaining her husband's royal authority. Margaret looked around the court and saw exactly what the situation was. Powerful nobles who would happily declare her son illegitimate, seize power for themselves, and eliminate potential rivals. She understood that diplomacy and traditional queenly behavior would get her murdered or imprisoned. So she stopped being a diplomat and became a fortress. She effectively seized control of the royal seal, the physical stamp that validated royal commands. She gathered supporters, built a faction of nobles and officials loyal to her personally, and made it clear she would fight anyone who threatened her son's inheritance. On the other side, Richard, Duke of York. He was the wealthiest man in England, owner of vast estates generating enormous revenues. More importantly, he had royal blood. He was directly descended from Edward III through both his father's and mother's lines. He had a legitimate claim to the throne that was arguably stronger than Henry VI's own claim, if you traced lineages carefully enough. York looked at the catatonic king and saw opportunity, not just to influence policy or gain position, but to seize actual control of the kingdom. He marched into the power vacuum with his private army, pushed Margaret aside through sheer force and political maneuvering, and declared himself Lord Protector of England, essentially regent, ruling in the king's name. He locked up his political rivals. He staffed government offices with his supporters. He ruled England with an iron fist while claiming he was saving the kingdom from corrupt advisors who'd caused the French disasters. For over a year, the tense standoff continued. Margaret plotted from the margins, gathering supporters, nursing grudges. York governed, consolidating power, eliminating threats. The great nobles watched carefully, trying to determine which side would win so they could align accordingly. Then on Christmas Day 1454, something impossible happened. Henry VI blinked. He looked around the room with confusion visible in his eyes for the first time in 16 months. He asked where he was. The fog that had imprisoned his mind lifted as mysteriously as it had descended. Physicians had no explanation. Modern doctors looking at historical accounts suggest possible diagnoses: catatonic schizophrenia, severe depressive disorder, some form of psychotic break. But medieval observers just knew the king had returned from wherever his mind had been trapped. You might think this would solve everything. The king is back. The government can function. Crisis over. Instead, Henry's recovery doomed England to civil war, because Margaret immediately seized her now conscious husband and started whispering in his ear that Richard of York was a traitor who'd usurped royal authority, imprisoned loyal servants, and planned to steal the throne. Within days of Henry's recovery, York was stripped of the protectorship. His supporters were fired from government positions. His allies were arrested or forced to flee. York himself, realizing that Margaret was moving to have him charged with treason, fled London for his estates in the north. The choice facing Richard of York was brutally simple: submit to royal authority, return to court, and almost certainly be arrested, tried for treason, and executed. Or fight. He chose to fight, but not by going into hiding or seeking exile. He gathered his private army, thousands of professional soldiers loyal to him through wages and livery, and marched them toward London with explicit intent to force his way back into power by removing the evil counselors surrounding the king. This is critical to understand. York wasn't trying to overthrow Henry VI. Not yet. His official position was that he remained loyal to the king, but needed to remove corrupt advisors, specifically the Duke of Somerset, who were ruining the kingdom. This fig leaf of legality was important psychologically. Medieval warfare had rules, and one absolute rule was that attacking the king's banner, fighting against forces explicitly commanded by the anointed monarch, was not just treason, but a sin against God's ordained order. Every soldier marching with York knew that crossing that line meant potential damnation as well as execution. The forces met at St. Albans, a small town about 20 miles north of London, on May 22, 1872. The Battle of St. Albans, the first engagement of what would become the Wars of the Roses, deserves its dramatic name, despite being more of a street brawl than a proper battle. Here's what actually happened. The king's forces, commanded by the Duke of Somerset and including King Henry himself under the royal banner, barricaded themselves inside St. Albans. They blocked the narrow streets with wagons and timber, creating improvised fortifications. Outside the town, York's army waited. For hours, nothing happened except tense negotiations. Messengers rode back and forth. Letters were exchanged. York maintained he only wanted Somerset removed, not to harm the king. Somerset insisted York was a traitor who must submit. The soldiers on both sides stood in the spring sun, sweating in their armor, growing increasingly bored and frustrated. Around noon, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, York's nephew and one of the wealthiest, most powerful nobles in England, decided he was tired of waiting. While the commanders were still debating, Warwick took 600 archers and quietly circled around to the back of the town. They found a weak point, not fortified gates, but a row of civilian homes with gardens and yards backing onto the street. Warwick's men smashed through garden fences, trampled vegetable plots, and burst into St. Albans Market Square from behind the barricades. The shout went up, "A Warwick, a Warwick, the Earl's war cry!" And suddenly, the air filled with arrows. Not the long-range volleys typical of medieval warfare where archers fired from hundreds of yards away. This was point-blank archery in confined urban streets. English longbowmen, the same soldiers who'd slaughtered French knights at Crécy and Agincourt, were now using their fearsome weapons against other Englishmen at ranges where you could see the whites of their eyes. The psychological shock was immense. Arrows punched through plate armor and mail at close range. Knights in heavy armor stumbled over market stalls and slipped on cobblestones slick with waste and blood. The confined space prevented proper formation or organized response. Panic spread through the royalist forces like fire. Then the unthinkable happened. King Henry VI, standing under his royal banner in the market square, was struck. An arrow grazed his neck. Another pierced his hand. The King of England, God's anointed representative on earth, was bleeding from enemy arrows. In any previous conflict, this would have stopped the fighting immediately. Soldiers would have been horrified at the sacrilege. But Warwick's archers kept shooting. The taboo was broken. The king was no longer an untouchable sacred figure. He was a target in a kill zone. Amidst the chaos, York's forces hunted for specific prey. The Duke of Somerset realized the battle was lost and sought refuge in an inn called the Castle Inn. There was no sanctuary. York's soldiers surrounded the building. Somerset, understanding there was no escape and facing certain capture and execution, made a final choice. He kicked open the door and charged out alone, swinging his sword, determined to die fighting rather than be captured. He managed to kill 4 men before he was hacked to pieces on the doorstep. The entire battle lasted perhaps 30 minutes. When the violence ended, the streets were quiet. York's soldiers controlled the town. King Henry, wounded, traumatized, possibly slipping back into catatonia, was found in a local abbey. Richard of York walked through the carnage to where the king was being treated. He knelt before Henry, handed him the crown, and swore his eternal loyalty. It was political theater of the most cynical kind. York was trying to pretend nothing fundamental had changed. He just performed necessary surgery to remove the cancer of Somerset from the body politic. But everything had changed. The nobility looked at the blood on the cobblestones and understood the rules were gone. If you could shoot the king and butcher his chief minister in the streets and face no real consequences, then no one was safe. Violence was now the only currency that mattered. For several years after St. Albans, there was uneasy peace punctuated by political maneuvering. York controlled the government again, ruling as protector. Margaret plotted revenge. Henry drifted in and out of competence, his mental state fragile and unpredictable. Then in 1460, the fragile settlement collapsed completely. York pushed too far. He convinced the weak-willed Henry to sign the Act of Accord, a treaty stating that Henry would remain king for his lifetime. But upon his death, the crown would pass to Richard of York, completely disinheriting Henry's own son, Prince Edward. For Queen Margaret, this wasn't a political compromise. It was a declaration of war against her child. She refused to accept any settlement that robbed her son of his birthright. She took the prince and fled to the wild northern regions of England, areas where royal authority was weak and local lords operated almost independently. And she did what her husband couldn't. She built an army. She promised Scottish mercenaries the right to raid and loot English towns in exchange for their swords. She rallied northern lords who hated York with promises of land and power. Within weeks, she'd assembled a massive force, fueled by promises of plunder and vengeance. Richard of York, hearing of the threat, marched north to his stronghold at Sandal Castle to crush this rebellion before it could gather more strength. He was fatally overconfident. Christmas 1460 was spent inside Sandal Castle's cold stone walls. York and his second son, Edmund, were surrounded by Margaret's much larger army. What happened next is debated by historians. Some claim York was lured out by false promises of negotiation. Others suggest he grew bored or impatient with siege conditions. What's indisputable is the outcome. On December 30th, 1876, Richard of York opened Sandal's gates and led his forces out to fight. It was a massacre. Margaret's forces, outnumbering York's army, significantly swarmed them like locusts. The battle lasted perhaps an hour. The Yorkist army was annihilated. Richard, Duke of York, the man who'd spent a decade maneuvering to control England, who had legitimate royal blood, who'd ruled as protector twice, was pulled from his horse and hacked to death in the mud. Death was not enough for the Lancastrians. They wanted to send a message that would echo across England. They found Richard's body and cut off his head. Someone remembered his lifelong ambition to wear the crown and decided to grant it in the most mocking way possible. They fashioned a crude crown from paper and straw, jammed it onto his severed, bloody head, and mounted the head on a spike above Micklegate Bar, the main gate into the city of York. A sign was placed beneath, reading, "Let York overlook the town of York." It was ritual humiliation designed to destroy not just the man, but the entire Yorkist cause. York's 17-year-old son, Edmund, Earl of Rutland, was also captured after the battle. As the teenager begged for his life, Lancastrian Lord Clifford stared him down and delivered one of the most chilling lines in English history. "By God's blood, thy father slew mine, and so will I do thee and all thy kin." He then drove a dagger into the boy's heart. This execution of a surrendering teenager changed the fundamental nature of the war. Until Wakefield, there had been some pretense of chivalry, some possibility of reconciliation through negotiation. But the murder of a child and the grotesque mockery of York's corpse proved that this was now total war. Quarter would not be given. Prisoners would not be ransomed. This was extermination. In London, when news of his father's death reached Edward York's eldest son and heir, he didn't collapse in grief or despair. He was 18 years old, already an experienced military commander, and he prepared to unleash a level of violence that would make Wakefield look like a preliminary skirmish. On Palm Sunday, March 29th, 1800, Edward met Margaret's Lancastrian army at a place called Towton in Yorkshire. If you could travel back in time to stand in those frozen fields, you would witness something closer to hell than anything in medieval European history. Between 50,000 and 75,000 men gathered to fight, roughly 2% of England's entire population, concentrated in a few square miles of Yorkshire countryside. To put that in perspective proportionally, it would be like 5 million Americans fighting a single battle today. The weather was apocalyptic. A freak blizzard howled across the plateau, driving snow horizontally into the faces of the Lancastrian army. They were effectively fighting blind. Snow caking their visors, wind cutting through their armor. Edward, tall, charismatic, and tactically brilliant despite his youth, used the weather with ruthless precision. He ordered his archers to step forward, loose volleys into the blinding wind, and step back. The wind carried Yorkist arrows further than normal, plunging them into Lancastrian ranks the defenders couldn't even see. When the Lancastrians tried to return fire, the wind blew their arrows back into their own faces or caused them to fall harmlessly short, sticking into the frozen ground. It was systematic slaughter before the melee even began. Desperate to stop the arrow storm, the Lancastrians charged blindly through the blizzard. What followed was 10 hours of continuous hand-to-hand combat, so dense that men died standing upright, their corpses held vertical by the press of bodies around them. For centuries, historians thought accounts of Towton's brutality were exaggerated propaganda. Then, in 1996, construction workers excavating near Towton Hall uncovered a mass grave. The skeletons inside told a story that shocked modern forensic scientists. These weren't men who died in combat from single killing blows. They were victims of frenzied, personal violence that continued long after death. One skull showed evidence of being struck 20 times. Another had a square hole punched through the forehead, the distinctive signature of a poleaxe warhammer, but also showed the jaw sliced completely in half and the entire cranium crushed. This level of overkill suggests something beyond professional battlefield killing. In the chaos of the rout, victorious soldiers were removing helmets from wounded enemies and systematically smashing their faces while they lay helpless. The order from Edward was explicit: no quarter. Take no prisoners. As the Lancastrian line finally broke under the sustained pressure, the retreat became a catastrophe. They tried to flee across the Cockbeck, a small river behind their position. The bridge had been destroyed earlier in the battle. Men in 60-pound suits of plate armor plunged into the freezing water and drowned immediately, dragged under by the weight of metal. More soldiers arrived at the riverbank. Desperate to escape the Yorkist pursuit, they scrambled over the drowning men, pushing them down, using their comrades' bodies as stepping stones. The pile of corpses grew higher. Eventually, the mass of bodies was so thick that pursuing Yorkist soldiers simply walked across what contemporary accounts described as a bridge of bodies to hack down survivors on the opposite bank. The slaughter continued for miles beyond the battlefield. The snow turned crimson. Local legends claim the Cockbeck ran red with blood for 3 days afterward. Even today, farmers plowing fields around Towton occasionally unearth human bones and fragments of rusted weapons. By the time the sun set, approximately 28,000 men lay dead. 28,000. In a single afternoon, the entire aristocracy of England had been decimated. Family lines that had existed for centuries were extinguished. The old nobility, the class that had ruled England for generations, was bled white on that frozen Yorkshire field. Edward walked out of the carnage as King Edward IV at age 18. He had avenged his father's death and seized the crown through raw military dominance. But the price was a generation of Englishmen fertilizing Yorkshire soil. The young king who emerged from Towton's bloodbath looked like he'd been designed by propaganda artists. Edward IV was 19 years old and stood 6'4" tall, a giant in an era when the average man was barely 5'7". He was handsome, charismatic, fearless in combat, and hedonistic in peace. He cultivated an image of solar majesty, adopting the sun in splendor as his emblem, a golden sun with rays bursting outward, symbolizing a new dawn after the dark winter of Henry VI's madness. To the people of London, exhausted by civil war and desperate for stability, Edward was a rock star, young, victorious, radiating confidence and strength. He threw lavish celebrations. He was accessible and charming in ways that the mentally fragile Henry VI had never been. But to one man, Edward was supposed to be something much simpler, a puppet. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, already known as the Kingmaker, had spent his personal fortune and risked his life to put Edward on the throne. He'd commanded the forces at St. Albans. He'd been crucial at Towton. He'd used his vast wealth and network of retainers to provide the military muscle that made Yorkist victory possible. and he assumed the arrangement was clear. Warwick would run the country from behind the scenes, and Edward would be the handsome public face who married whoever Warwick told him to marry, allied with whoever Warwick wanted as allies, and generally did what he was told. Warwick spent months in France negotiating a marriage treaty between Edward and a French princess. It was the culmination of his diplomatic career, an alliance with France that would secure England's position, generate peace dividends, and demonstrate Warwick's power to make kings and forge international treaties. He promised the French court that the young King of England was his to command, that the marriage was a certainty. While Warwick was in Paris drinking wine with French nobility and finalizing treaty details, Edward was riding into the woods of Northamptonshire for a very different kind of meeting. The king had become obsessed with a woman named Elizabeth Woodville. She was everything a medieval king should not marry. She was a widow with 2 sons. She was 5 years older than Edward. Her first husband, Sir John Grey, had died fighting for the Lancastrians against the Yorkists. Worst of all, from an aristocratic perspective, she was effectively a commoner. Her family had minor noble status, but nothing approaching royal blood. When Edward demanded she become his mistress, which was his right as king, and which he'd be foolish to refuse, given the protection and wealth such a position offered, Elizabeth allegedly held a dagger to her own throat and refused. Marriage or nothing. Edward, a 19-year-old king who'd never been told no in his life, did something completely insane. On a quiet morning in May 1464, he married her in a secret, private ceremony with almost no witnesses. When Warwick returned from France, carrying his triumph, a completed marriage treaty with France's royal family, Edward dropped the news like a grenade. He wasn't going to marry the French princess Warwick had negotiated for. He was already married to the Woodville widow. Warwick's humiliation was complete. He'd been made to look like a fool before the kings of Europe. The French treaty collapsed instantly. France became hostile, and Warwick, who'd thought he controlled the king, realized he controlled nothing. If it had just been Elizabeth, Warwick might have swallowed his pride and adjusted. But Elizabeth didn't come alone. She brought with her an enormous, hungry family, 2 sons from her previous marriage, 5 brothers, and 7 unmarried sisters. The Woodvilles descended on the royal court like locusts. Every wealthy heir or heiress in England was suddenly snatched up and married to a Woodville sibling, creating a web of family connections that monopolized power and wealth. The breaking point was both political and personal. Warwick had an elderly aunt, the wealthy Duchess of Norfolk, who was in her 60s. The Queen arranged for her 20-year-old brother, John Woodville, to marry this elderly woman purely to access her fortune. It was a scandal that disgusted the entire nobility, blatant gold-digging elevated to royal policy. The sun in splendor was no longer shining on the men who'd put Edward on the throne. He was only illuminating his wife's relatives. Warwick watched from the sidelines as his influence evaporated, as offices and positions he'd expected for his family went to Woodvilles, as the ungrateful king he'd made ignored his advice. And Warwick began to understand something fundamental. The man who makes kings can also unmake them. He started writing letters, secret correspondence to old enemies, looking at opportunities. The king had a younger brother, George, Duke of Clarence, who was jealous of Edward and could be manipulated. Warwick saw a new chess piece to play. What happened next was political theater so grotesque it still shocks historians. Warwick, finding himself pushed completely out of power, tried to stage a coup using the king's own brother. When it failed, he was branded a traitor and forced to flee England with his family. He grabbed ships and sailed across the English Channel to France, where he found refuge with King Louis XI, the universal spider of European politics, a master manipulator who loved chaos in England. There, in Louis's court, Warwick was forced to do something that must have felt like swallowing poison to regain power in England. He had to ally with Margaret of Anjou, the she-wolf, who had ordered his father's execution after the Battle of Wakefield. The meeting between Warwick and Margaret was electric with mutual hatred. For 15 minutes, Warwick was forced to remain on his knees in absolute silence, while Margaret stared him down from her seat. She made him beg, made him publicly admit his errors, made him grovel. Finally, she agreed to the alliance, but the price was steep. Warwick had to pledge his army to restore her husband Henry VI to the throne, the same Henry VI that Warwick had helped depose. To seal this deal in blood and ensure neither party could betray the other without destroying their own family, Warwick's younger daughter Anne was betrothed to Margaret's son, Prince Edward. The kingmaker had officially switched sides. The man who put Edward IV on the throne was now committed to removing him. In 1470, Warwick landed in England with a French-funded army. The speed of the collapse shocked everyone. Edward IV, caught completely off guard while dining near Doncaster, barely had time to pull on his boots. His own brother Montague, another Neville who'd been wavering in loyalty, betrayed him at the critical moment. Edward fled to the coast with a handful of loyal followers, jumped onto a small merchant ship, and escaped to Burgundy, modern-day Belgium, with literally nothing but the clothes on his back. The King of England was a penniless exile. Warwick marched into London as a conquering hero and went straight to the Tower of London, not to imprison someone, but to free someone. What he found was pathetic. King Henry VI was no longer the confused young man of 1453. He was a broken, filthy shadow living in squalor. He'd been imprisoned for years, wearing rags, seemingly unaware of what year it was or why he was in prison. Contemporary accounts describe him as almost unrecognizable from neglect. Warwick took this confused, damaged man, cleaned him up, dressed him in expensive blue velvet, and paraded him through London's streets as the restored king. It was pure political theater. Everyone knew Henry wasn't ruling. Warwick was the power behind a puppet king who probably didn't understand what was happening. But Warwick had achieved his ultimate revenge. He'd destroyed Edward IV and taken control of England. The problem was that this entire arrangement was built on mutual hatred barely contained. The alliance between Warwick, who'd killed Lancastrians for a decade, and Margaret of Anjou, who'd ordered the execution of Warwick's family members, was held together by nothing but shared desire for revenge against Edward. It couldn't last. And across the narrow sea in Burgundy, Edward IV was not finished. He was humiliated, broke, and furious. But he was also young, charismatic, and absolutely determined. He spent months gathering support, borrowing money, assembling a mercenary force. In March 1471, Edward landed back in England with a small army. His initial strategy was pure deception. He claimed he wasn't trying to reclaim the throne. He just wanted his private lands and titles back as Duke of York. This bait-and-switch fooled just enough people. Once he'd gathered momentum and support, he dropped the pretense and marched straight for London. The city opened its gates. Edward arrested the pathetic Henry VI and locked him back in the Tower. Then he turned to face Warwick. On Easter Sunday, 1471, the two armies met at Barnet, just north of London. The weather once again played a decisive role in English history. A thick, supernatural fog blanketed the battlefield. Visibility was perhaps 5 yards. You couldn't see friend from enemy except at arm's length. In this confusion, tragedy struck the Lancastrian forces. The Earl of Oxford, commanding part of Warwick's army, successfully charged Edward's forces, broke through, looted the baggage train, and then attempted to return to the battle to support his allies. But in the dense fog, Warwick's other troops couldn't identify Oxford's men. Oxford's badge was a star with streaming rays. In the mist, it looked too much like Edward's sun and splendor emblem. Warwick's soldiers, already paranoid about treachery, saw what they thought was the enemy banner appearing in their rear. Panic erupted. Screams of treason echoed across the foggy battlefield. Warwick's troops began firing arrows into Oxford's returning soldiers, their own allies. The Lancastrian line collapsed into fratricidal chaos, fighting itself in the fog. Warwick, realizing the battle was lost, tried to flee, but the Kingmaker was now in his early 40s, overweight, wearing heavy armor. He couldn't reach his horse. Edward's soldiers caught him in a small wood. They pried open his visor and stabbed him through the throat. The man who had made and unmade kings, who had switched sides multiple times, who had treated the throne of England like a game piece, he was left bleeding out in the mud. His body was stripped naked and displayed in St. Paul's Cathedral for 3 days so everyone could see the Kingmaker was truly dead. But the war still wasn't over. Margaret of Anjou had just landed in the west of England with her son, the Lancastrian heir, Prince Edward. When she heard of Warwick's death, she reportedly collapsed in grief and despair. But she had no choice except to fight. This was her son's only chance. The final confrontation came at Tewkesbury on May 4th. Edward IV, now a seasoned and ruthless commander, outmaneuvered Margaret's forces tactically. But the most terrifying figure on that battlefield was not the king, it was his younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard was small, slight, possibly suffering from scoliosis that would later inspire Shakespeare's hunchbacked villain characterization. But on the battlefield, he was absolutely ferocious. Commanding the vanguard, Richard smashed through Lancastrian defenses with a violence that shocked even veterans. The battle became a slaughter. In the chaos, Margaret's son, Prince Edward, the Lancastrian heir, the boy she'd fought for since his birth 17 years earlier, was cut down. Some accounts say he was captured fleeing the battlefield and brought before King Edward IV, who slapped him across the face. The prince allegedly shouted defiance, and Edward's brothers, including Richard of Gloucester, stabbed him to death. Other accounts say he simply died in the melee like thousands of others. It doesn't matter which version is accurate. The result was the same. The Lancastrian male line was extinct. Margaret of Anjou was captured not as a queen but as a childless, broken widow. Edward IV returned to London on the night of May 21st, 1877, in triumph. That same night, a convenient tragedy occurred in the Tower of London. The official announcement stated that former King Henry VI had died of pure displeasure and melancholy upon hearing the news of his son's death at Tewkesbury. In reality, melancholy looks suspiciously like blunt force trauma to the skull. When Henry's remains were examined centuries later, forensic analysis showed his hair was matted with dried blood, and there was evidence of skull fracture. Most historians point the finger at one man, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. As Constable of England, Richard controlled the Tower and would have had both access and motive. Killing Henry VI made sense from a cold political calculation. As long as Henry lived, he was a potential rallying point for future Lancastrian rebellions. With Henry dead and his son killed at Tewkesbury, the House of Lancaster was finished. The Wars of the Roses seemed to be over. Edward IV had won decisively, but they'd forgotten one thing. When you kill all your external enemies, the only people left to fight are your own family. Let's talk about contemporary parallels, because the Wars of the Roses teaches lessons that echo through every political system. Think about succession crises triggering civil war. Henry VI's incapacity created vacuum, competing claims. Modern Congo, Mobutu's decline, power struggle. Libya, Gaddafi's death, fractured. Syria, Assad succession fears contributed to civil war. Yugoslavia, Tito's death, disintegration. Clear succession prevents war. Unclear succession invites it. Think about bastard feudalism, private armies loyal to individuals, not state. Modern warlordism. Afghanistan warlords with private militias. Somalia, clan militias. Mexican cartels, private armies. Wagner Group, private military corporation. Private armies undermine state monopoly on violence. Think about mental health affecting governance. Henry VI's catatonia paralyzed government. Modern leaders' mental health matters. Wilson, stroke. Hidden. FDR, declining health. Yalta. Reagan, possible early Alzheimer's. Stalin, paranoia, affected purges. Mental incapacity creates power vacuums. Think about dynastic claims justifying violence. York versus Lancaster, both legitimate Plantagenet lines. Modern succession dispute. Monarchy still relevant. Tribal leadership lineage matters. Even corporate family business succession wars. Legitimacy through blood persists. Think about foreign mercenaries in civil wars. Margaret hired Scottish mercenaries. Edward hired Burgundians. Modern foreign fighters ubiquitous. Syria, Hezbollah. Russian contractors. Libya, Turkish. Russian, Sudanese mercenaries. Yemen, UAE, Saudi. Mercenaries prolong civil wars. Think about switching sides for survival. Nobles changed allegiance multiple times. Modern civil wars breed betrayal. Syrian rebels constant faction switching. Somali clan alliance fluid. Afghan warlords sided with Soviets. Mujahideen, Taliban, US, depending on advantage. Survival trumps ideology. Think about child soldiers, victims. Edmund of Rutland, executed age 17. Prince Edward, killed 17. Modern child combatants. Sierra Leone, Liberia child soldiers, Syria teenagers fighting, child victims of adult conflicts, universal tragedy. Think about queens as power players. Margaret of Anjou was military, political leader. Modern women in power, struggles. Imelda Marcos, political force. Leila Trabelsi, Tunisia influence. Assad's wife image management. Gender doesn't determine political ruthlessness. Think about marriage as political weapon. Edward IV's secret marriage to Woodville destroyed Warwick alliance. Modern political marriages. Dynastic alliances. European royalty. Elite intermarriage creates networks. Strategic marriages shape politics. Think about regicide as ultimate taboo breaking. Attacking, killing kings broke fundamental rules. Modern assassinating heads of state. Kennedy, Sadat, Rabin. Bhutto assassinations destabilize. Killing leaders crosses line, enables further violence. Think about propaganda through corpse display. York's crowned head on spike. Modern displaying, enemy dead. Mussolini, hung, in public. Gaddafi body displayed. Saddam's son's photos released. Hussein execution video. Displaying dead sends message. Often backfires, creating martyrs. Think about fog of war, literal and metaphorical. Barnett fog caused friendly fire. Modern confusion in combat. Blue-on-blue incidents, Gulf War, Afghanistan. Chaos creates casualties regardless of technology. Think about economic blockade, strangulation. Woodville's monopolized wealth, power. Modern economic warfare. Oligarchies capture resources. Corruption networks control economy. Cronyism concentrates power, breeds resentment. Think about legitimacy through force. Edward IV took throne by military victory. Modern military coups claim legitimacy. Myanmar military rule. Egypt Sisi coup. Many governments trace legitimacy to force, not elections. Think about exile and return. Edward fled to Burgundy, returned months later. Modern exiled leaders. Khomeini returned Iran. Lenin returned Russia. Exiles wait for opportunity, sometimes successfully return. Think about private wealth enabling political power. Warwick's personal fortune funded armies. Modern wealthy individuals shape politics. Oligarchs Russia. Ukraine. Billionaires political influence. Campaign finance. Koch brothers. Soros. Wealth is power. Think about betrayal by family members. Clarence betrayed Edward. Montague betrayed Edward. Modern family political splits. Kennedy family different politics. Political dynasties fracture. Blood doesn't guarantee loyalty. Think about ritual humiliation of enemies. Paper crown on York's head. Modern humiliating defeated enemies. Iraq Hussein statue toppled. Libya Gaddafi sodomized. Romania Ceausescu execution broadcast. Humiliation satisfies revenge but creates martyrdom. Think about mental illness stigma affecting succession. Henry VI's madness was shame. Modern mental health and leadership. Depression, anxiety, PTSD in leaders hidden. Stigma prevents open discussion of cognitive fitness. Think about weather determining battles. Blizzard at Towton, foe at Bonnet. Modern environmental factors. Russian winter Napoleon, Hitler. Vietnam monsoons, desert storms. Climate affects operations always. Think about forensic evidence revealing war crimes. Towton mass grave showed overkill. Modern war crimes tribunals. Rwanda, mass graves evidence. Bosnia forensic archaeology. Syria, documentation efforts. Physical evidence reveals atrocities. Think about no quarter orders. Towton, no prisoners taken. Modern extermination warfare. Genocide's deliberate killing of prisoners. ISIS mass executions. Showing no mercy escalates violence. Think about child heirs' vulnerability. Young Edward V made vulnerable target. Modern succession minors at risk. Throughout history, child rulers murdered. Power abhors vacuum. Children are easy to eliminate. Think about falsified death reports. Henry VI died of melancholy, actually murdered. Modern official lies about deaths. Stalin's victims died of illness. Suspicious deaths, political opponents. Autopsy denials. Official narratives versus forensic evidence. Think about religious legitimacy. Divine right king as God's anointed. Modern theocracies' religious legitimacy. Iran's supreme leader religious authority. Saudi custodian of 2 holy mosques. Taliban Islamic Emirate. Religious legitimacy still matters. Think about civil wars devastating aristocracy, elite. Wars of Roses decimated nobility. Modern revolutions eliminate old elites. French Revolution aristocracy destroyed. Russian Revolution nobility eliminated. Cultural Revolution educated, class targeted. Civil conflicts restructure societies. Think about marriage alliances sealing political deals. Warwick's daughter to Margaret's son. Modern strategic marriages. Royal families still intermarry. Political dynasties, Bush-Clinton connections. Elite intermarriage creates networks. Think about crown as physical symbol. Crown found under hawthorn bush at Bosworth. Modern symbols of authority. Presidential seals. Crowns. Scepters. Physical symbols matter psychologically beyond actual power. Think about kingmakers versus kings. Warwick thought he controlled Edward. Modern power behind throne. Éminence grise. Rasputin. Kissinger. Party bosses controlling politicians. Svengali figures. Real power, often invisible. Think about total war escalation. Started political, became extermination. Modern conflicts escalate. Syrian protest to genocide. Rwandan tensions to genocide. Yugoslav nationalism to ethnic cleansing. Escalation is easy. De-escalation nearly impossible. Think about age of commanders. Edward became king at 19. Modern young leaders. Alexander conquered 20s. Bonaparte general at 26. Many great commanders were young. Youth brings aggression, energy, risk-taking. Think about height advantage. Edward's 6'4" was psychological advantage. Modern height and leadership. Tall leaders perceived as more competent. Physical presence matters in politics still. Think about hedonism and governance. Edward IV's excess eventually killed him. Modern leaders' personal lives. Clinton, JFK, personal behavior. Berlusconi, lifestyle. Boris Yeltsin, alcoholism. Personal vices affect governance. Think about coups and counter-coups. Warwick's readaptation. Edward's return. Modern unstable states. Coup cycles Thailand. Egypt. Power changes hands violently, repeatedly when institutions weak. Think about imprisonment of rivals. Henry VI in prison. Freed. Imprisoned. Killed. Modern political prisoners. Opponents. Jailed Russia. China. Belarus. Imprisonment is tool of power. Also creates martyrs. Think about secret marriages causing political crisis. Edward Woodville marriage was secret. Modern scandals from hidden relationships. Leaders' secret marriages. Affairs. Transparency versus privacy in leadership. Think about economic inequality breeding resentment. Woodville enrichment disgusted nobility. Modern inequality and instability. Oligarch wealth. Corruption. Inequality creates conditions for conflict. Think about disappeared persons. Princes in Tower vanished. Modern forced disappearances. Argentina, dirty war. Chile, Pinochet. Syria disappeared thousands. Disappearances are tool of terror. Think about victors writing history. Tudor historians portrayed Richard III as villain. Modern historical narratives contested. Stalin controlled history. Iraq, Saddam's version. North Korea mythology. Winners control narrative initially. Think about legitimate claims contested. York versus Lancaster, both had claims. Modern contested legitimacy. Israeli-Palestinian competing narratives. Kashmir. Taiwan, PRC. Legitimacy is constructed, contested. Think about English fighting English. Civil war, not foreign. Modern civil wars more common than interstate. Syria, Yemen, Libya, Colombia. Internal conflicts dominate modern warfare. Think about private retinues versus national armies. Nobles' liveried retainers fought. Modern militia versus regular military. Paramilitary groups. Private military companies. Non-state armed actors challenge state monopolies on violence. Think about battlefield archaeology revealing truth. Towton excavations showed brutality. Modern forensics in war crimes. Srebrenica mass graves. Cambodia killing fields evidence. Archaeological evidence supplements historical records. Think about execution of prisoners post-battle. Tewkesbury Lancastrians killed after surrender. Modern war crimes. Katyn's Soviet execution of Polish officers. My Lai. Prisoner executions are war crimes but occur. Think about financial costs of civil war. Noble families bankrupted. Modern civil wars destroy economies. Syria GDP collapsed. Yemen humanitarian catastrophe. Economic devastation from internal conflict. Think about foreign intervention in civil wars. French supported various sides. Modern proxy wars. Syria multiple foreign backers. Yemen Saudi, Iran. Libya, Turkey. Russia. Civil wars attract foreign intervention. Think about castles, strongholds. Tower of London was prison and palace. Modern fortifications dual use. Government buildings symbolic and functional. Prisons, political and criminal. Physical control points matter. Think about population demographics. Wars killed 2% of population Teuton alone. Modern demographic catastrophes. Rwanda genocide 1-0, 20% killed. Cambodian genocide 25%. Wars devastate populations. Think about spousal influence on policy. Margaret of Anjou drove policy. Modern first ladies, spouses. Eleanor Roosevelt. Hillary Clinton. Imelda Marcos. Spouses' influence often underestimated. Think about mental health treatment, medieval era. Torture as cure for Henry. Modern history of mental health treatment lobotomies. Electroshock. Progress is recent. Stigma persists. Think about primogeniture creating conflicts. Inheritance laws bred disputes. Modern succession rules matter. Monarchy strict, primogeniture. Corporations, family business succession. Clear rules prevent conflict. Think about sieges and blockades. Tower of London, imprisonments. Modern Zegis, Sarajevo, Aleppo. Blockade Gaza, Yemen. Cutting off supplies is ancient tactic, still used. Think about chronicle bias. Histories written by victors. Modern all sources biased. Read critically. Multiple perspectives necessary. Primary sources reflect authors' positions. Think about diplomacy failure leading to war. Negotiations at St. Albans failed. Modern diplomatic breakdowns. WWI failed diplomacy. Cuban Missile Crisis nearly failed. Diplomacy prevents war when it works. Think about revenge cycles. Clifford killed Rutland for father's death. Modern blood feuds. Tribal conflicts, generational revenge. Israeli-Palestinian cycle of retaliation. Revenge begets revenge endlessly. Think about symbolism of locations. Bosworth Field where crown found. Modern symbolic site. Battlefields become memorials. Independence halls. Locations have meaning beyond geography. Think about medical technology affecting casualties. Medieval medicine couldn't save many wounded. Modern combat, medicine advancement. WWI gangrene. Infection. Welville, i.e. penicillin. Today, trauma surgery. Medical tech determines survival rates. Think about irregular warfare within civil war. Guerrilla tactics used. Modern insurgencies and civil wars. Syrian rebels asymmetric. Afghan civil war guerrilla. Regular and irregular warfare coexist. Think about taxation and rebellion. Financial pressures contributed. Modern taxes and unrest. American Revolution taxation. French Revolution financial crisis. Fiscal stress breeds instability. Think about trial by combat. Medieval disputes settled by violence. Modern rule of law replacing violence. But many societies still resolve disputes through force. Legal systems prevent private violence when functional. Think about banners and heraldry. Visual identification, crucial. Modern uniforms, insignia, flags, military identification, national symbols, visual markers of identity and allegiance. Think about ransom economics. Nobles ransomed, commoners killed. Modern kidnapping economics. Hostage-taking. Ransom still funds groups. Differential treatment based on value. Think about battlefield looting. Common practice. Modern war spoils. Pillaging still occurs despite laws. ISIS looted. Nazi systematic looting. Theft in warfare persists. Think about climate-affecting campaigns. Winter. Blizzards shaped battles. Modern climate is constant factor. Russian winter defensive advantage. Monsoons limit operations. Climate change will affect future conflicts. Think about intelligence failures. Poor information led to bad decisions. Modern intelligence, crucial. Pearl Harbor, 9/11 failures. Good intelligence prevents disasters. Think about communication speed. Messengers on horseback. Modern real-time communications revolution. Satellite, internet. Communication speed shapes operations. Think about war exhaustion. 30 years of civil war exhausted England. Modern long conflicts exhaust societies. Afghanistan, Soviet, U.S., both left exhausted. Vietnam, U.S. withdrew, exhausted. Will has limits. Think about reconciliation, post-conflict. Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, symbolic unity. Modern post-conflict reconciliation. South Africa, truth and reconciliation. Rwanda Gakaka course. Reconciliation is hard but necessary. Think about historical memory shaping identity. Wars of Roses remembered differently. Modern national narratives. Every country has founding myths. Memory shapes present politics. Think about centralization versus fragmentation. Tudor monarchy, centralized power. Modern state building consolidates power. Fragile states, power diffuse. Strong states, centralized. Centralization enables governance, also enables tyranny. Think about legitimacy through victory. Henry VII won Bosworth, became legitimate. Modern revolution creates legitimacy. Mao Long March. Gastro-revolution. Legitimacy through struggle. Think about disappearance creating mystery. Princes in tower, unknown fate. Modern mysteries endure. Missing persons cases unsolved. Uncertainty fuels conspiracy theories. Think about succession planning. Failure to ensure clear succession caused war. Modern succession crises destabilize. Corporations, succession fights. Nations' coups during transitions. Planning prevents chaos. What's the final lesson of Wars of the Roses, 1453 to 1485? Civil wars, triggered by succession crises and enabled by private armies, can destroy entire ruling classes, create power vacuums that only absolute monarchies can fill. England's nobility literally slaughtered itself. Dukes of York, Somerset, Exeter, Buckingham, Clarence, Gloucester, Suffolk, Northumberland, all dead. Dozens of earls, hundreds of knights, entire aristocratic families extinguished. Why succession crisis when Henry VI became catatonic created vacuum? Multiple legitimate claimants to throne York versus Lancaster branches of Plantagenets. Private armies, bastard feudalism meant nobles had military means to contest. Breakdown of taboos, once king could be shot, killed. All rules gone. Revenge cycles, each atrocity justified next. Lasted 30+ years. Multiple battles. Tens of thousands dead. Ended when Henry Tudor, weak claim. Smart politics won Bosworth. Married Elizabeth of York, uniting houses symbolically. Centralized power. Destroyed bastard feudalism. Established absolute Tudor monarchy. Modern confirmation. Civil wars are most destructive conflicts. Syria ruling class fractured. Libya, Gaddafi's removal. Civil war. Yemen, multi-sided civil war. Rwanda elite eliminated. Weak succession plus armed factions plus breakdown of norms equals catastrophe. Wars of Roses teaches succession must be clear and uncontested. Ambiguity invites conflict. Modern constitutions specify succession. Corporate governance defines who succeeds. Clarity prevents disputes. Private armies undermine state authority. Bastard feudalism let nobles wage private wars. Modern state monopoly on violence is foundation of stability. Warlordism, militias, PMCs challenge this. State must control violence. Mental health of leaders matters enormously. Henry's catatonia triggered everything. Modern leaders' cognitive fitness affects policy. 25th Amendment, U.S. presidential disability. Succession when leaders incapacitated. Health transparency important. Breaking taboos enables escalation. Once king could be attacked. All limits gone. Modern norms prevent violence. Breaking norms, torture. Targeting civilians. Using WMDs enables further escalation. Maintain norms or spiral to total war. Revenge cycles are self-perpetuating. Clifford killed Rutland for father, enabling further revenge. Modern Israeli-Palestinian cycle. Sectarian conflicts, Sunni-Shia. Blood feuds generational. Breaking revenge cycle requires conscious effort. Foreign intervention prolongs civil wars. French, Burgundians, Scots all intervened. Modern Syria, multiple foreign backers. Yemen, Saudi, Iran. External support prolongs conflicts that might otherwise end. Women can be ruthless political actors. Margaret of Anjou was military leader, strategist. Modern gender doesn't determine political behavior. Women leaders: Thatcher, Mayer, Gandhi, capable of ruthlessness. Marriage alliances create political complications. Edward's secret marriage destroyed Warwick alliance. Modern personal relationships affect policy. Political marriages less common, but elite intermarriage creates networks. Physical symbols matter psychologically. Crown, banners, standards, modern flags, seals, monuments. Symbols shape identity and legitimacy beyond rational calculation. Economic interests drive alignment. Nobles switched sides for advantage. Modern, follow the money. Alliances shift with economic interests. Loyalty is often transactional. Total war devastates societies. 2% of population killed at Towton alone. Modern civil wars destroy. Syria, 500,000 dead, half population displaced. Rwanda, genocide. Total war is catastrophic. If this war changed how you see civil conflicts and succession crises, subscribe to Maproom Battles. Comment what modern civil war most resembles. Wars of Roses. Thanks for walking through this dynastic nightmare with us. Remember, clear succession prevents war. Private armies undermine states. Mental health affects governance. Breaking taboos enables escalation. Revenge cycles self-perpetuate. Foreign intervention prolongs conflict. These lessons from 1453 to 1485 still apply. Serious succession questions about Assad enabled opposition. Multiple armed factions, like bastard feudalism. Broken norms, chemical weapons use. Revenge cycles sectarian. Foreign backers: Russia, Iran, Turkey, us. Result: catastrophic civil war. Libya succession vacuum after Gaddafi. Armed militias, private armies. Tribal, regional conflicts. Foreign intervention. Yemen's succession dispute contributed. Multiple factions. Saudi, Iran backing. Revenge cycles. Rwanda, elite power struggle. Hutu, Tutsi. Escalation to genocide. Because civil wars follow patterns, succession disputes create openings. Armed factions compete. Norms break down. Revenge drives escalation. External actors intervene. Societies devastate themselves. Wars of Roses was this pattern. 15th century England. Created vacuum filled by Tudors who centralized power. Ended bastard feudalism. Created absolute monarchy. Modern equivalents: civil wars often end with strongmen. Assad consolidated power. Kagame post-genocide Rwanda. Putin post-Soviet chaos. Strong men fill vacuums created by civil conflict. Not always good outcome, but pattern persists. English nobility slaughtered itself so thoroughly that it created conditions for Tudor absolutism. Margaret Beaufort's son became Henry VII, not because strongest claim, but because everyone with stronger claims was dead. That's the brutal logic of civil wars. They continue until one side achieves total victory or exhaustion, forces compromise. And they destroy so many people that survivors accept almost any authority promising stability. Henry VII was smart enough to understand this. He didn't just win at Bosworth. He systematically dismantled the system that created the wars. He banned private armies through laws against livery and maintenance. Nobles could no longer maintain large armed retinues. He centralized justice, undermining nobles' private courts. He married Elizabeth of York, symbolic unity of houses. He ruthlessly eliminated potential rival claimants imprisoned, executed, or neutralized anyone with Plantagenet blood who might challenge Tudor rule. He transformed English monarchy from first among equals to absolute sovereign. The Wars of Roses destroyed the old nobility so thoroughly that it enabled this transformation. Sometimes catastrophe creates conditions for new systems. French Revolution destroyed Ancien Régime, enabled Napoleon's consolidation. Russian Civil War destroyed Old Order, enabled Soviet system. Syrian Civil War will eventually end. Whatever emerges will be built on ruins. That's the pattern. Destroy the old completely. Build the new on corpses. Wars of Roses destroyed medieval English aristocracy. Tudor England rose from that graveyard. When you think about civil wars, whether historical like Wars of Roses or contemporary like Syria, Yemen, Libya, remember, they start from specific triggers: succession, legitimacy, power vacuum. They escalate through breakdown of norms and revenge cycles. They're enabled by armed factions competing for power. They're prolonged by external intervention. They devastate societies, killing enormous percentages of populations. They end when one side wins totally, or exhaustion forces compromise. They create conditions for new systems, often authoritarian. Wars of Roses started because Henry VI went catatonic Christmas 1453, creating power vacuum with no clear succession mechanism when king was alive but mentally absent. Escalated because York and Margaret competed, breaking taboo by attacking king at St. Albans. Continued through revenge cycles: Wakefield beheading leading to Towton, massacre leading to Lancastrian extermination. Multiple armed noble factions with private armies competed. French, Burgundian, Scottish intervention, prolonged conflict. Ended when Henry Tudor won Bosworth 1485. Married Elizabeth. Centralized power. Created Tudor absolute monarchy from ruins of nobility. 32 years. Tens of thousands dead. Entire aristocratic class decimated. New system emerged. That's how civil wars work. England, 1453 to 1485, teaches same lessons as Syria. 2011. Present. Succession matters. Armed factions destroy. Norms breaking enables escalation. Revenge perpetuates violence. Foreign backing prolongs. Exhaustion eventually ends it. Survivors accept strongmen, promising stability. If you want to understand why civil wars are so destructive and hard to end, study Wars of Roses. If you want to understand how succession crises trigger conflicts, study Henry VI's Catatonia. If you want to understand revenge cycles, study Wakefield to Towton to Tewkesbury progression. If you want to understand how conflicts end, study Henry VII's consolidation. Because patterns persist. Technology changes longbows to rifles to drones. Specifics change medieval castles to modern strongholds. But human behavior in power vacuums, and succession disputes, and revenge cycles constant. Wars of Roses is laboratory for understanding civil conflict. Study it. Learn from it. Apply lessons to modern conflicts. Because forgetting history means repeating it. England forgot lessons of medieval civil wars. Had another English Civil War, 1642 to 1651. Patterns repeat when lessons aren't learned. See you in the next battle. The princes in the tower deserve special attention because their disappearance represents the moral nadir of the Wars of the Roses and illustrates how far England's ruling class had fallen from chivalric ideals. In Sommer 1483, two boys, Edward V, 12, and Richard, Duke of York, 9, were imprisoned in the Tower of London by their uncle Richard, who then took the throne as Richard III. The boys were seen playing in the Tower gardens initially, then only at windows, then not at all. No announcement was made of their deaths. No bodies were produced. They simply vanished. For 500 years, historians have debated what happened. The logic pointing to Richard III as their murderer is damning. As long as those boys lived, they were rallying points for rebellion against Richard's rule. Every nobleman who resented Richard's usurpation could claim to be fighting to restore the rightful king, Edward V. Richard had already demonstrated willingness to kill. To secure power, most historians believe he ordered Henry VI murder. He'd seen his own brother, Edward IV, deal with threats ruthlessly. From Richard's perspective, killing two children might have seemed a terrible but necessary calculation, a state execution to prevent another round of civil war. But there's no definitive proof. The children vanished. In 1674, workmen renovating the tower found a wooden chest buried deep under a staircase containing skeletons of two children. The depth and concealment suggest desperate effort to hide evidence. But forensic science cannot definitively prove these were the princes or determine when or how they died. What matters historically is not whether Richard actually murdered them, but that England believed he had. The disappearance turned England's stomach. Even in an age of brutal violence, child murder was a line supposedly not crossed. Richard III had the crown but lost the nation's soul. When Henry Tudor landed in 1485, he gathered support, not because of his weak genealogical claim, but because people were desperate for anyone who wasn't the suspected child murderer. This illustrates a critical lesson about power force can seize thrones, but legitimacy requires more than military victory. Richard won the crown through superior force and legal maneuvering, declaring Edward IV's children illegitimate. But he never achieved genuine legitimacy. He was never accepted. His 2-year reign was consumed, fighting rebellions, and rebellions in planning. At Bosworth, large portions of his own army refused to fight for him, standing aside to see who would win before committing. The Stanleys' betrayal of Richard wasn't exceptional disloyalty. It was rational calculation by men who'd concluded Richard had no real legitimacy and therefore no future. Henry Tudor understood this better than Richard. After Bosworth, Henry didn't just claim the throne by conquest. He dated his reign to the day before Bosworth, making everyone who fought for Richard technically traitors who could be pardoned. Creating obligation and establishing Henry's mercy. He married Elizabeth of York within months, uniting the houses symbolically. He created the Tudor rose, white rose of York, superimposed on red rose of Lancaster as visual representation of unity. He ruthlessly eliminated potential rival claimants, but claimed to be acting to prevent return to civil war. He positioned himself as the man who ended the nightmare, not just another warlord in the cycle. This propaganda worked. The Tudor dynasty lasted until 1603. The mythology they created of bringing peace after chaos, of uniting the kingdom, of ending the destructive Wars of the Roses became England's founding narrative. The fact that this narrative was partly propaganda doesn't make it entirely false. The wars did end. The new system did provide stability after Henry dealt with some initial rebellions. The nobility never regained the autonomous military power they'd possessed before the wars. Here's the profound irony. The Wars of the Roses destroyed the English aristocracy so thoroughly that it created conditions for constitutional development that would eventually limit royal power more than the old nobility ever had. The Tudor monarchs were absolute in ways medieval kings never achieved. But that very absolutism eventually provoked resistance that led to parliamentary supremacy. Henry VIII could break from Rome and dissolve monasteries. Elizabeth could rule without parliament for years. But their successors faced parliament that had learned to use financial control as leverage. The English Civil War, 1642 to 1651, was partly Parliament checking royal power that Tudors had concentrated. The Glorious Revolution, 1688, established parliamentary supremacy. Ironically, by destroying the old nobility, the Wars of the Roses created conditions for eventual democracy. Not intentionally. Medieval nobles fighting at Towton weren't thinking about future constitutional development, but their mutual slaughter removed the class that had mediated between Crown and Commons, eventually forcing Commons to check Crown directly. This is how history works sometimes. Catastrophes create unexpected outcomes. WWI destroyed European monarchies, enabled democracy and totalitarianism. World War II destroyed European empires, enabled decolonization. Arab Spring destroyed stable dictatorships, enabled both democracy and chaos. Wars of Roses destroyed medieval nobility, enabled Tudor absolutism, which eventually provoked parliamentary resistance, leading to constitutional monarchy. Unintended consequences across centuries. Final lesson. Systems that concentrate power in individuals, medieval monarchy, depending on king's personal capacity, are vulnerable to individual failure. Henry VI's mental collapse. Modern democracies with institutional continuity and clear succession are more resilient, but they're also products of catastrophes that destroyed earlier systems. Constitutional development rarely comes peacefully, usually bought with blood. England's parliamentary democracy was built on corpses from Wars of Roses. English Civil War. Glorious Revolution. American democracy was built on Revolutionary War. Civil War corpse. French democracy built on revolution. Multiple republics. Wars. Democracy is expensive. If this helps you understand civil wars, succession crise, and political violence, subscribe to Maproom Battles for more. Thanks for exploring this dark chapter with us. Remember, clear succession prevents war. Private armies undermine states. Mental health affects everything. Breaking norms enables escalation. Revenge perpetuates. Legitimacy matters beyond force. Systems built on corpses. History teaches if we listen. See you next time.